Welcome, everybody, to our second webinar in this series between WXN and the Diversity Institute and the 50/30 Challenge. Today, we present Measuring the Impact of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiatives on Organizational Performance. I'm Virginia Johnson. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications at WXN, Women's Executive Network. WXN is a one-of-a-kind community shaping the future of leadership across North America. We bring together thousands of bold women, allies, corporate members into a rich and diverse ecosystem of professional development, networking, thought leadership, belonging, and celebration that all propel professional women to rise and lead. And we're so pleased to have all of you here from across Canada that have joined us for today's event. Before I begin, I wish to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples whose presence continues to enrich our communities. As some of our colleagues and partners are joining us online, we recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on, and with that, we ask that if this is the case, you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory that you are on and the current treaty holders of those lands. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon territory is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Thank you. And now for today's topic. While many organizations have applied an EDI lens to their organizational strategy, research has shown that fewer organizations have the robust metrics for evaluating the success of these initiatives. This webinar will speak to how to apply an EDI lens to all aspects of the value chain and will explore how to measure the success of an organization's EDI strategy. It is my pleasure to introduce our facilitator to this session, Nancy Mitchell. Nancy is the Director for Research Special Projects at the Diversity Institute. She holds a master's degree in political science with a graduate collaborative specialization in women and gender studies at the University of Toronto. Her professional background is in gender equality and diversity, equity, and inclusion. She previously worked with UN Women, supporting numerous initiatives, including gender equality in the workplace and women entrepreneurs. Nancy has also published multiple editions of the State of the Industry report with the Unstereotype Alliance on Diversity and Inclusion in Advertising. At the Diversity Institute, Nancy works with stakeholders across the public sector, private sector, and civil society to develop research and strategies to embed diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility into organizational processes. She has published the City of Markham's Diversity Action Plan and Eliminating Anti-Black Racism Action Plan, the Socioeconomic Review of the Black Muslim Population in Canada, the Micropedia Microaggressions, and manages the work of part of the 50/30 Challenge, among others. I've personally had the pleasure of working with Nancy on a number of events and projects, and I'm so pleased to have her leading this session today. And with that, welcome, Nancy.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. Give me a second. I'll get my screen going. Okay, amazing. So thanks again for having me. Like Virginia said, my name is Nancy Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her. I'm also in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about measuring the impact. So EDI within your organization, and how you can really measure what you're doing well and what can be improved when it comes to internal perspectives, so supporting staff, volunteers, et cetera, and then also external perspectives, so supporting clients, communities, et cetera. So what I plan to do today is talk to you a little bit about the why. Why is it important to measure, collect data, et cetera, to really understand the impacts? And then I also want to give you some tangible tips or tools to embed measurement within your frameworks. I know that for some people, at least myself, when I started this work, I found data really daunting, just in terms of understanding what data to collect, how to do that in a thoughtful and mindful way, how to do that in a way that wasn't extractive, but also gave me the insights I needed to make changes. So I wanted to give you kind of the why, but also tips and tools of how to collect that data and then use it to inform your policies, your processes, etc. Before we get started, just a little bit about the Diversity Institute. I'm sure many of you know us already, and if you came to the session previously with Dr. Sukir, she would have shared this. But for those of you who are new on the line, the Diversity Institute was formed in 1999. We are a research institute that exists within Toronto Metropolitan University, and we have over 100 full-time staff and researchers that do this kind of work on a daily basis. So we're really I guess, goal oriented towards conducting research on the experiences of different equity deserving groups in the labor market from a big picture, from a societal perspective, but then also honing in and helping organizations with their specific strategies, whether it's a broad EDI strategy, a strategy to address anti-Black racism, etc. So we're taking that research that we develop with our partners, etc., and then creating tangible strategies for change. Okay, so I always like to start out with the why. The reason being that the Diversity Institute exists within a business school. And so I think it's really important to note that EDI work, and I should say EDIA work, so equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility, is good because it's good for people, it's good for human rights, it's the right thing to do. But not only that, it's the smart thing to do for a number of reasons. And if you've come to one of our sessions previously, you probably have seen this slide before. It's something that we always start our presentations with, but it really speaks to the case for EDIA from an internal and an external perspective. And something that I want to highlight is that those two buckets are not mutually exclusive. They actually feed on one another. And when you properly measure your efforts and your impact, that also has the same kind of benefits from an internal and an external perspective. So I'll give you just a brief example. We know that talent pools across Canada are changing. We see differences when it comes to influxes of immigrants. We know that many youth are actually from the 2S LGBTQ plus community. Indigenous youth are a fast growing demographic in Canada. So the talent pool in general is changing. And I think we see that we have multi-generational talent forces as well, where you have Gen Z with millennial, Gen X, et cetera, all coexisting in one workspace. So what does that mean? It means that if you're an organization, you need to be really mindful of any barriers that exist to entry when it comes to wanting to work with your organization. So even thinking of things like, are your job postings accessible? Do people from the general public see your organization as a place where they can go, feel respected, included, they're able to thrive, they can move up into leadership roles, etc. So, because we're so diverse, you want to be making sure that you're mitigating any barriers to entry and growth for your organization for these diverse communities. But how does that link to the external? Well, we know that in general, communities are changing. And I'm sure each of you comes from an organization where you support clients or communities. Maybe you're a private sector organization that provides services. Maybe you come from a city and thus the changing demographics of a community or your constituents. So you're always trying to support them in ways that make sense for them. And when you have diverse people in your organization and specifically around your decision-making table, you're better placed to respond to the diverse needs of your clients, your consumers, your constituents, your communities, etc. That also kind of links to fostering innovation, creativity, and diverse thought. When you have diverse people or people in all their diversity around the decision-making table, you're better placed to come up with new solutions, innovative ideas, creative thoughts, etc. So if you had a homogenous decision-making table, you might not be thinking about the ways that your services are not accessible to people with disabilities. You might not be thinking about the different marketing channels you could be using to reach new immigrants, for example. But if you had a heterogeneous decision-making table, you could be better placed to make those decisions. And I should say, of course, it's everyone's responsibility to be thinking of these things like diversity, accessibility, et cetera. But it's a little bit easier when you have people with those lived experiences sitting around that table. And I think we've seen in recent years that people are really doing this EDI work from a good place. But what really matters is the thoughtful implementation of efforts. So you can be doing this work, but you want to make sure that you're measuring the impact of it. You're collecting KPIs, you're using data to understand if your efforts are working so you can stay on that course, or if you need to pivot and if something could be changed or improved. So that's what we'll talk about today. Let me just check the time. Okay. So why do we measure and collect data? I wanted to start out by talking about the societal level, but then we'll spend most of our time for today talking about the organizational level and then how that has trickle down impacts at the individual level. So the importance of the societal level. This is to say that as a society, we collect high-level data all the time. You can think about the Government of Canada census. You can think about other metrics that the government maybe collects or big organizations collect to better understand experiences of populations broadly across Canada, across different provinces and territories, across cities, etc. So you can think about the data that the government is collecting on employment rates, health, housing, immigration, etc. And those high level insights are really important because I think as an organization, sometimes you maybe not you don't have the initial insights or capacity to collect data yourself, but you can leverage some of those high level insights and say, okay, well, we're an organization that's in Toronto. Let me pull some of the information that is coming from the census, et cetera, to figure out who maybe our clients or our communities or our constituents are. So that high level data can always be leveraged from an organization to kind of shape some of your understandings of the people who are A, in your talent pool, like I mentioned, or B, are your clients. Um, at the top, so at the societal level, that data is really important for understanding the unique needs and experiences of different communities, as well as understanding gaps and disparities among consumers, clients, communities, et cetera. So that kind of data that the government is collecting, maybe it will reveal health disparities between the Black community and all other Canadians, for example. It's helpful to understand trends. So, for example, immigration trends, health trends, etc. And then it's really helpful for allocating goods and services. Something at the societal level also is that typically it has a hand in influencing organizations like many of you who might be subject to regulations like the Employment Equity Act, the Pay Equity Act, etc. So I just wanted to touch on that briefly because the societal level does have an influence in your insights as organizations. And this is just an example I wanted to highlight. I won't spend too much time, but just an example of some of the data that's being collected at a high level that you could leverage for your own insights if you aren't an organization that's collecting robust data at this time. It doesn't mean that your efforts have to stall. Okay, so the importance at the organizational level. So I talked a little bit about it a couple slides back, but really understanding the needs that exist from a staff or an internal perspective and the needs that exist from an external perspective. So when you collect data and you measure your efforts, you're better placed to understand if the people who are working at your organization, A, have the ability to move up along the ranks into leadership roles, so that kind of rise. B, do they feel supported and welcomed and valued? And all of those things then contribute to productivity, retention, attrition rates, that kind of thing. So it helps with overall your organizational culture, which then yields those benefits. And then externally, you'd be better placed to understand client and consumer satisfaction, who's actually accessing your services, do they like your services, etc. So perhaps you are someone from a city on the line, for example. You could be leveraging data and measurement frameworks to be understanding, okay, we have a recreation department and we are the city of Toronto. And we know that the city of Toronto, about half the population is immigrants. We know that Toronto has a really heavily racialized population. Are those people accessing the recreation services that we're putting on? Could we be doing something differently to reach older adults from the Black community, older adults from the South Asian community, for example? Are people satisfied when they're using our services? If you are a smaller company, private sector, you could be leveraging these insights to understand, is our marketing actually resonating with communities? Are they reaching the different communities? Are people using our services? What are they saying about them? How can we tailor our services to these different communities? I wanted to give another example. So the College of Nurses of Ontario is actually using that kind of data to better inform how they support people accessing health services, which I think is really interesting. Before I continue on to the individual benefits of data collection and measurement, I did want to highlight some cases where this maybe didn't go well. And this is because it's important to remember that when you're designing your services, your products, etc., if you don't have those diverse perspectives from the very get-go or beginning of design, then the actual development and delivery of those services or products probably will not meet the needs of your clients, consumers, et cetera. And if you don't have those measurement frameworks in place to understand if they're working, you'll continue to perpetuate this cycle of putting out products or services, et cetera, that don't resonate. And then you're not doing anything to resolve that problem. So I think Dr. Sukir has showed this slide before. I wanted to bring it up again to just show, I know this is from a research perspective, but so much of the research that has governed our lives has perhaps been done in a way that didn't consider the needs of women or racialized people, et cetera, in the very design. And because of that, the output wasn't actually helpful for women or racialized people, et cetera. And if there aren't, like I said, those measurement frameworks in place, we wouldn't actually know the impacts of automotive safety systems not actually supporting women, and thus women being more likely to be injured in car accidents, for example. So I know that's kind of researchy, but just think about it in the context of your work and the services you provide for your communities. Some other examples of how data has been used to actually understand disparities and thus tailor solutions. You can think about the COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that we started to collect race-based data and then better understand that racialized communities and Indigenous peoples are disproportionately impacted by things like pandemics, as a way to then provide services and supports to these communities that are more tailored than if we just provided those same supports for the general public. Something else that I think is really interesting that DI is actually working on, but I'm seeing it broadly, is understanding the impacts of climate change, recognizing that some communities, like equity deserving groups, are more disproportionately impacted by the impacts of climate change, and how if we're going to be building infrastructure that's resilient to climate change, those needs of equity deserving groups need to be incorporated and then measured against in the development, design, and delivery of infrastructure. So you can see, again, just to reiterate, that the actual design of the thing, whether it's health services, infrastructure, a piece of automotive equipment, et cetera, your services. It needs to be designed with the perspectives in mind. And then there needs to be a feedback loop of, okay, is it working in the way that we intended it to? An example that I wanted to bring up is the Nielsen Norman Group. So what they did was try, and I'm sure that there's many of organizations that are doing something similar, and you on the line might be doing something similar as well, but understanding that perhaps older adults had different needs when it comes to screen brightness, et cetera, and then tailoring to ensure that people of all different ages were actually able to use their devices. And this is not, super innovative, but it's just to say that this is a really baseline example of saying, okay, we put something out, let's see if it's working with different demographics. Oh, it's not. Okay, let's put a new process in place to make sure that those people can access our goods and services. And then the importance at the individual level. Of course, all of the data and measurement that's collected at society trickles down into the organization. The organization collects that data to understand whether staff and communities are supported, whether they're represented, et cetera. And that has impacts for all of us as individuals. So if I am going to apply for an organization and I know that they do this kind of data collection and measurement, and I know that then they're leveraging that to develop tailored supports, I'm more inclined to say, okay, it looks like I'm going to have perhaps opportunities to enter and grow, advance into leadership roles, et cetera. That same logic applies for a consumer. If I see that an organization is putting in an effort to understand if my needs are being met, perhaps I'm more likely to consume that good or service. I think also, and it's not to say that people on the line need to feel validated, but it is to say that when you measure and collect data, there is a level of feeling less alone. Like I know as a racialized woman, I'll have experiences and I'm wondering, I wonder if other people are having that same experience. But when you collect that data and you measure, you can say, okay, it looks like our services are actually not meeting the needs of racialized women. And it becomes more of a collective rather than individuals just feeling this and not knowing where to go or not knowing how to say it out loud. Okay. So the next bit is kind of, we've talked about the why, and I now want to go into the how. So for the next couple of sections, of the presentation, we'll talk about how you can embed measurement into your overall strategies, and that could be an EDI strategy or your organizational strategy in general. And then I'll give you some more granular insights in terms of like actual data collection, what data you can be using, quantitative versus qualitative, some of the biases that are baked into processes when you're interpreting data. And I know that's a little bit technical, so I'm happy to share the slides after, but I do think it's helpful because I know that sometimes people have these questions. So overall, we've talked about why you want to do this. Now we're talking about how you're going to do this. So I think first, it's really important that you ensure that you have some kind of strategy set out. And I know that a lot of organizations have an EDI strategy, and that's great. I think this is where a lot of it can be embedded. But you might also just have a general organizational strategy, which is fine too. You just want to be ensuring that you're providing an EDI lens to the actions that you've set out. But you have your strategy overall. Um, and then in the strategy, typically, all strategies look different, but typically strategies tend to have the same kind of components. So you'll have your overall goal, you'll have an action or a couple of actions, and then you'll have your KPIs or your key performance indicators. And your strategy can have a number of goals. I'll give you an example in terms of like what a goal, an action, and a KPI can look like when they're all coupled together. But I think that's a nice flow. And then, of course, you can add additional things like timelines. You can also add responsibilities. Think, for example, if you are in a city and perhaps you have all these different divisions or departments, it might be nice to parse it out and say, you know, the goals of the bylaw division are these and the goals of the parks are these. And if you're a big organization, that might work out as well. The goals of the marketing department are this. If you're smaller, it might be nice to just have overall goals that everyone's kind of striving to. Just thinking of maybe some of the SMEs on the line and making sure this is tailored to them as well. Okay, so the first step is you're really defining your goals. You're determining the goals that the organization would like to achieve. So just a general example from an internal and external perspective. From an external perspective, you might be a mental health organization and you want to ensure that more members from the Black community are accessing your services. Granular, high level, that's your goal. You've realized that you're kind of in like a racialized pocket of the city and you want to ensure that Black people are accessing your services. Okay. So now you're defining a couple of actions that might yield towards that goal. So perhaps you're looking at the actual logistics of your services. Are they at times that different Black communities can access? Are they in locations that are accessible to diverse Black communities? Are they in multiple languages? What about your marketing? Are you using channels that Black communities actually use and access? For example. So all these different actions are things that you have put together, hopefully from insights actually internally from, you know, staff, Black staff, et cetera, and also leveraging the relationships that you hopefully have with the community to understand some of these actions. And these actions are hopefully supporting your overall goal, right? And then you have your KPI, and that's really what you're looking forward to. So perhaps you know that you have a certain percentage of Black individuals already accessing your services and you want to increase that by a percentage. Or, you know, in the next 3 years, you want to have X% of Black individuals accessing your services. So we want to make sure that our KPIs are both realistic. And I'll show you some examples of how you can set baselines, et cetera. But you want to ensure that your KPIs are realistic, but also aspirational, right? So that's kind of how you would parse out. And if you're thinking about an internal example, perhaps we go with a broader goal and we say that we want staff in our organization to feel supported and included. Broad, but that also lends, you know, many more actions. So you can think about the policies that you're going to put in place. You can think about specific actions for managers. You can think about developing employee resource groups, et cetera. So all these different actions. And then you can have a couple of KPIs that would then determine whether you're on track. I'm thinking something like X% of your staff feel supported. And I'll give you some tools of how you would actually measure that as we go into the presentation. But you can see an internal perspective or way of defining your goals, actions, KPIs, and then an external one. Something really important to note is when you're doing measurement and collecting data, it's a cyclical, ongoing process. It's never something, because I should say, EDI work is not something that you know, one and done. So this kind of work is cyclical, it's ongoing. So you're going to set all those things that we talked about on the previous slide. You're going to implement efforts to collect the data that gets you the insights you need. You're going to assess the results and evaluate whether you're actually making progress towards your KPIs, towards your goals, etc. And that's going to tell you whether your actions are on the right track, or perhaps you need to pivot. Perhaps you need to stay on the path you're going. Perhaps actually it's not the logistics of your services, it's actually the marketing of your services. And you need to pour a little bit more into the marketing and keep the logistics of your services the way they are. So that allows you to then refine and improve. And then, of course, as demographics change, as community needs and preferences change, you're going to continue to do this cycle to make sure that you're constantly meeting the needs of the people you serve and support. A couple of tips just on setting KPIs, because I think this is a place where I find people often get stuck. One of the things I would say is really know your baselines and review your current metrics. Some of you might already be collecting data, and that's great. If you were looking to increase the percent of a population accessing your services, or you wanted to ensure that your staff feel welcome and included, you might want to start by understanding, well, what are the current levels of inclusion, or what is the current representation of people accessing our services? And I know that's a bit daunting, but everyone has to start somewhere. So if it really just starts with you administering some kind of internal or external survey, that's where you're starting. And then you're getting a baseline, and then you can say, okay, it looks like 75% satisfaction rate, hopefully, internally. Now let's beef that up, and maybe let's go for 90 in the next 2 years. But you have to start somewhere, and it's important, if you're already collecting that data, leverage that baseline. And if you're not, let's try to create one. I think also something that can be a little bit daunting is people going out and thinking they have to create whole dashboards of KPIs, et cetera, et cetera. What's helpful is always figuring out if you already collect some of this data and then leveraging those existing mechanisms to collect additional data. So whenever I'm helping an organization, I'll try to go in and look at the data that they currently collect and say, okay, it looks like you already have a survey. Perfect. Let's add these 3 questions to cover off that satisfaction piece. And again, I know that maybe some of you are totally new to data collection and measurement, so you don't have this. But if you are not, it's helpful to leverage what you already have. Another thing I think is really helpful is knowing your timelines. Like I said, EDIA work is ongoing, it doesn't end, but you may be looking to increase the satisfaction over the next 5 years, which is great, very aspirational. You can also set some intermediary timelines to say, in 2026, we want to have achieved this. In 2027, we want to have achieved this, etc. And then, of course, you want to ensure that you're communicating for transparency. It's important that internally people are aligned with what your goals are, what your actions are, and what success, quote unquote, looks like. I say success loosely because, of course, it's not that it ends. It's just that hopefully the actions you've put in place are yielding positive results. But you want to ensure that everyone in the organization is aligned so that everyone is working towards common goals. I should say that whenever you're doing this kind of measurement or data collection, it's not about checking a box. It's really about that cyclical process I mentioned earlier of defining your objectives and your goals, the actions that hopefully get you there, leveraging the insights from your staff and from the relationships you've built with the community. And then ongoing, in a cyclical, ongoing way, reviewing to meet the needs of people internally and externally. But it's not about just saying, oh, well, we now have 75% satisfaction. We've met our KPI, so we can close shop, right? Okay, so what do we measure? And I can't see the chat or the Q&A, but I think there's lots of stuff going on, so I'm happy to answer as we get closer to the end of the session. But what do we measure? I also wanted to give you some insights in terms of what kind of data you can collect, what that looks like, what kind of tools and what I'll call like vehicles exist. So is it a survey? Is it a focus group, et cetera? Like how should you really get started? This is a lot. It's really data-y, but I found that this really helped me when I started to my journey of understanding measurement and data collection, et cetera. So there are tons of types of different data. You have your quantitative data, you have your qualitative data, and you have your mixed method data. So let me break this down for you. Your quantitative data is really the hard numbers. So perhaps you wanted to understand the percent of women in your organization and in leadership roles. That's quantitative data. And you can think about, if we go back many, many slides ago, at the societal level, the government collects data on women in management roles across different provinces and territories, and it shows that women are underrepresented. So, societal level information, you're an organization and you're thinking, I wonder if that applies to us. So perhaps you can do some sort of internal collection to understand how many women are actually in your organization and whether they're rising the ranks into leadership roles. But that would be an example of number quantitative kind of data. And I'll also talk about data disaggregation in upcoming slides. Then you have your qualitative data. Numbers alone are often insufficient. They just give you the number. But qualitative data is where you get into experiences and the why and the stories. So this is really understanding experiences and perspectives when it comes to your procedures, your initiatives, your efforts, your policies. Perhaps you've now uncovered that you actually have, women are underrepresented in leadership roles in your organizations. So that's the quantitative. The qualitative is the why. Why are they underrepresented? And if you actually talk to women in your organization, it might be that there are limited opportunities for mentorship and sponsorship. It might be that when women actually get into leadership roles, they're under supported when it comes to budgeting, personnel, et cetera, what we call the glass cliff. It might be that women in your organization are getting siloed into roles that don't actually have a clear pathway to those high-level C-suite roles. It might be that you don't have proper parental supports in place. It might be that you don't offer flexible work arrangements. So I can think of a whole host of things. The qualitative is where the stories come in, and I will give you some examples of how you can collect that qualitative information. If we talk about the external, same thing. Perhaps you could be looking at, the traffic to your website or the number of people from diverse communities accessing your services. Fine. But what's the why? Is it the logistics? Is it the marketing? Is it that people don't see themselves reflected in the people that deliver the services, for example? So ultimately, what we'd want to be doing when we're measuring our efforts is we'd want to be trying to take some sort of mixed method approach where you get those kind of hard numbers so you can see where the disparities exist. And then you want to be collecting the stories and the why so that your actions can address the why or the disparity. Let's talk a little bit about disaggregated data because I think this is really at the core of understanding disparities in an organization. So, what is disaggregated data? Disaggregated data is really perhaps we are trying to understand women in an organization, but women are not homogenous. There's racialized women, there's Indigenous women, there's women living with disabilities, there's women from the 2S LGBTQ plus community, newcomer women, so on and so forth. So there's all these different categories of women. We speak about intersectionality. And it's helpful because when you're putting in efforts in place, let's say you're a healthcare organization, a mental health organization, nonprofit, and you are trying to support the Black community, but you're treating the Black community as homogenous, and you're not realizing that Black Muslim individuals may have different disparities or different barriers in actually accessing your services. So you'd want to be trying to gather those kind of insights. Then you can set goals, actions, and KPIs to match. And then you can measure against those and see if your initiatives are helping or hindering. So just a note about disaggregated data that I know this can be a little bit tricky sometimes, but as much as you can, trying to dig a little bit deeper to consider intersectionality in your efforts. Let's check the time. I want to make sure I have time for questions. Okay. A lot of this relies on self-identification. Of course, we'd never want to be attributing our own biases to someone's identity. And so when you're trying to understand experiences or demographic data, et cetera, it really relies on someone sharing their identity with you. And I think the best way to do this is probably some kind of quantitative survey where you get a better sense of the people that work in your organization, and you provide a number of options for people to self-select, as well as opportunities for them to share their identity with you in the words that make sense to them and the way that they want to describe themselves. And similarly, let's say you've just put on a service or a program, a youth program, for example, the program has wrapped. You want to understand experiences. You can also have a section there that says, share with us about your identity. So you can kind of parse out, okay, the women who took this program really loved it, but the young men who took the program didn't find that it was super valuable to them. So you can kind of disaggregate based on the information we talked about on the previous slide, using self-identification, people sharing their identity with you. And then you can say, in the future, let's try to have some parts of our programming that speak a little bit more to the experiences of young men in our communities, for example. Okay, so we've talked about the why. We've talked about your EDI strategy and how you're going to set goals, actions, and KPIs, and some of the ways that you can set KPIs. And we've talked about what data looks like. And I think, again, it's just helpful because I don't want to give you a high level presentation of you should collect data without giving you insights in terms of what that kind of data could look like. But now I want to offer you what data collection and measurement could look like across the different facets of an organization. So we'll walk through all of the different buckets we have at the bottom and see what kind of data you might want to collect to provide insights on whether or not your workplace feels inclusive from a staff and employee perspective, and then also a community and a client perspective. Okay, so at the leadership level, this is really about leaders setting tone from the top, accountability, strategies, targets, etc. And what I would say is it's important here to understand whether your leadership team is diverse, and maybe some of you in the audience also have a board, and that would be important too because of the unique role that a board has in organizational decision making. So I would say that at the leadership level, the leadership team has a hand in developing that EDI strategy, help framing the goals and the actions with the support of staff and communities. But then at the same time, it's about measuring the diversity at that leadership team. And again, if we revisit some of the data I talked about previously, that could look like quantitative demographic data to understand, you know, the gender composition, the racial composition, people with disabilities, et cetera. And you could couple that with some kind of qualitative information to see whether or not people who sit around your leadership table, actually feel like their perspectives are valued. Because it's one thing to be sitting at the table, and you all in the audience know, it's another thing to have your perspectives valued at that table. When you're talking about your HR processes, here I really advocate for data collection across all what I'll call the different rungs or levels of an organization. So you might have really great representation of racialized staff at entry level, and that's awesome. But as they rise the ranks or the rungs, perhaps you see a break when it comes to middle management. And actually, there's some really interesting data that shows that there's a broken rung for women where they maybe are not accessing those middle manager positions that would then lead to more senior level roles. So if you can collect that kind of quantitative numbers data across the levels, you can better see where the gap is. And then, of course, you couple that with the storytelling experience. So along the rungs, you track it through the employee life cycle. You can also track employee turnover. And then you should also be tracking pay equity to ensure that people are getting paid the same amount for same work. Culture and values. I find that perhaps across all of the buckets that I introduced a couple slides back, this is the one that feels the most difficult to measure. I totally get it. I really like this graphic. So at the top of the iceberg, you have your tangible and visible aspects of culture, things like your dress code, office ritual, policy, etc. You have your less tangible aspects of culture. Hopefully they're being shared, but your mission, your vision, your norms, etc. And then you have deeper and less tangible things that are perhaps a little bit unspoken or underlying assumption, unstated social codes, basically how you maneuver in the workplace. And I think everyone on the line kind of has a sense of, this is what we say, but there's a different way that we maneuver in an organization. So overall, there are ways that you can measure values and culture in an organization. And I think a lot of it relies more on qualitative information, like the storytelling aspect, rather than quantitative information. And I will give you an example from my own personal efforts as a manager. And I am by no means a perfect manager, but something that I realized is like, let's reset a little bit as we go into the new year and let's figure out what are some of the things that staff really want to learn, or where are some of the knowledge gaps that staff have, and how can I put together some kind of mini survey, et cetera, that says like, here are the typical things that we talk about on a daily basis. We talk about procurement, we talk about strategy development, et cetera. Where do you think some of the gaps in knowledge exist, so we can do some internal team training? Like even something like that is kind of an informal thing that you could do as a manager, and it helps then understand some, well, I don't want to call them pain points, but pain points in your team or your organization, and how you can actually then support with ongoing learning. So even things like that create a more inclusive culture, a more welcoming culture, and a culture of development. But overall, a couple of things that you can measure when it comes to values and culture. Again, employee inclusion, feelings of belonging, support, relationships with colleagues and peers. And all of that would come from some kind of perhaps it's like interviews, focus groups, general conversations. I really think that all of this can actually also be embedded in the one-on-ones that, if you are a manager on the line, like if you're having one-on-ones with your employees, you should be embedding these kind of questions in your one-on-ones. How's our communication together? What could I change? What could you change? That kind of thing. So that it's ongoing. It could also be done in more formal ways like surveys, et cetera. But I do think a really authentic way is those kind of one-on-one engagements. Something else that I find often gets overlooked is exit surveys. Typically, when people are on their way out from an organization is when they are going to be more honest about their experience. So you could be getting those kind of insights and then using it to shape your actions in your strategy. You can be getting insights from your employee resource groups. And you can be also measuring the impacts of your policies. So perhaps you've now put in a new parental leave policy, and you could be getting a feel from your staff whether this is working. Now that you've put it in place, are there any unforeseen barriers or biases that you didn't think of that now you need to tweak the policy a little bit to account for? So those kind of things. Okay, when we talk about services, marketing, and communications, as well as outreach and expanding the pool, these are really external facing pieces. You can be collecting data on the diverse suppliers and vendors that your organization leverages. You can be collecting data on your marketing strategies, the metrics, the reach, etc. And all of that is like, if you have a LinkedIn account, you can pull that from the back end to see where your audience is, who you might be missing, et cetera. And then a really big piece that I think I've touched on so many times already, but it's the feedback and the perspectives of your clients, your communities, and your consumers. And you can be getting that all from surveys, conversations, relationships, focus groups, et cetera. And then outreach and expanding the pool. This is really the relationships you have with organizations in the ecosystem. You can think about the partnerships you have. Maybe you are an organization that provides youth programming, youth sport programming, for example. And you can think about the different relationships you have with other organizations that provide supports for youth in the ecosystem, and you can be sharing information, et cetera. But you won't know what you don't know until you have a sit down and think, okay, we have relationships with a lot of organizations that support South Asian youth, but we don't have those same organizations that support, Black and Indigenous youth. You can also be collecting information on where if you're an organization that invests or, invests in philanthropy, et cetera. Where is your money going? And could it be going to more diversified channels that also support your mission, your vision, and values? And then this is just a recap because I thought this might be helpful. So here are some metrics, 12 EDI metrics that you could be collecting when you're thinking of a demographics. Like I mentioned, you can be thinking of hiring demographics, representation in the workforce, retention, internal talent mobility. That's that rung piece that I mentioned. All of that helps you better understand the demographics internally, which helps with actions to support any disparities, and then KPIs that you can measure. Employee experiences, again, we talked about employee satisfaction, resource groups, pay equity, budget allocations and mentorship programs. Whether or not these are working, you could be getting insights from people who are actually in these programs to see if, they're satisfied, if there's other ways that the programming could be more tailored to their needs, better matching of mentor-mentee, et cetera. And then resources spent on EDI, and we talked about partners and vendors, et cetera. So All that to say is revisiting what we talked about a couple of slides back. You want to have your EDI strategy, you want to have your goals, your actions, your KPIs, and then here are a ton of metrics you can be using to understand, are our actions working well? What is the percent of women in leadership roles? Who's accessing our services? Where are we spending our money, etc. I do want to touch on this briefly because oftentimes when I do these kind of sessions, I get questions on how to do this in a thoughtful way. And I'll send the slides after if you need them because I know this is a lot of information. But I think it's important to be mindful of biases when you're doing measurement and evaluation. There's always the tendency to want to find information that confirms the story that we want to tell. And there's always ways that we can be presenting the insights to match the story we want to tell. So I'll give you an example. I put out a product and then I did a survey among consumers to figure out if they liked my product, and 70% did. Okay, there you go. That confirms the story that I want to tell, that my product is resonating with consumers, etc. On the flip side of that, there is the 30% that did not think my product was helpful and why. So we need to be sharing both of those sides of the coin and then figuring out what was going on with that 30%, who that 30% are. Perhaps you'll come to find out that the 30% are people who couldn't actually physically access your product or your service because it wasn't physically or virtually accessible, for example. So just being mindful of the tendency to confirm our biases or confirm the story that we want to tell, and the tendency to want to present that data in a way that's favorable to us. Actually, when you present both sides of the coin, you're better placed to figure out the disparities that exist on that other side. A couple of other things is just being mindful of where you're getting data or insights. If you're always getting those insights from the same people, like internal employee satisfaction, but you're not seeking it from all employees, it's kind of a skewed representation, right? Similarly, perhaps you put out a survey, the first couple of insights are great, so you think, oh, it's perfect, no need to continue. So you really want to be letting your data collection piece be ongoing and collecting as many insights as you can and presenting the story in a way that shows both the positive and the things that could be improved. And I just wanted to highlight that because I think it's helpful in keeping ourselves accountable when we're measuring. Something else that I think we should be really mindful of when you're doing measurement and data collection is the hesitancies that people, whether internally or your consumers and clients, might have in actually sharing their perspectives with you. And this comes on the heels of long legacies of, healthcare organizations taking information from racialized and indigenous communities and misusing it, et cetera, et cetera. But it's to say that there are ways, and if you're curious about this and more in depth, I can give you some more in-depth insights. But it's to say that when you're going to measure and collect this data, you do have to think about those biases on the previous slide, and you do have to consider some of the reasons that people would not want to share insights with you. Because it's all fine for me to say, measure, 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 collect data. But there might be reasons that people are not sharing insights with you, and that's a really valid concern. So some of the things you need to think of are just the general accessibility of the mechanisms you're using. If you're putting out a survey and it's super long, maybe people are not going to fill it out. If the survey is full of academic jargon, maybe people are not going to fill it out. If people don't feel that you're going to use their insights in an earnest, thoughtful way that's going to yield change, maybe they're not going to engage. So people ultimately need to feel like the strategy that you've set up, the goals you've set up, the actions, et cetera, are in good faith and are going to yield to positive results, hopefully in the long term, for people to be forthcoming with their perspectives. So consider all of these different things when you are putting your measurement frameworks in place so you can be sure that you've put in a robust framework and that people actually want to participate in it. We're nearing the end. I would just say that there's a couple of ways to actually collect the insights that you're looking for. The first, and I'll go through with quantitative and qualitative. So the first are surveys and questionnaires, and these can be both. You can have both your quantitative and your storytelling piece. This would be helpful for understanding the demographics of your staff, your leadership, and also your consumers and your clients. I have a lot of examples of surveys. If you're looking for something that you can leverage, feel free to let me know. Here you can also be asking about experiences, but in my personal opinion, I really like actually talking to people because you can feed off energy, etc. But it is to say that you can be asking long answer questions here too to say, did you like the program? Yes, no. What did you like about it? What would you change? And share with us a little bit more about your identity so we know who you are. You can have feedback forms, which I find is really helpful from an external perspective if you've just put on a program and you wanted to know if it worked or what could be improved. And you could do a similar thing. What worked well, what didn't, what would you improve from a logistics perspective? Did you find the facilitators were helpful? That kind of thing. And then you could put the demographic questions there. I love interviews and focus groups, something I do for my job on a daily basis. You can be doing this with your clients. You can also do it internally. Like I said, I find something really authentic is doing one-on-ones with your staff. It's almost like a mini interview, but you would be more casual, authentic, and just always being sure to check in and see what's working well, what are their strengths, what do they want to learn, um, where do they want to go career-wise, etc. But interviews and focus groups help you get more nuanced understandings of what's working well. And I have seen organizations put on a project or perhaps like a program to support entrepreneurs. And then they meet with these entrepreneurs after and collect some insights in the form of a focus group to then see how they can better tailor their program next time. So just a couple of vehicles for your data collection that might be helpful. And then we're almost at the end. I just wanted to wrap up by saying that if you are measuring and collecting data and doing that in a cyclical way, in a really thoughtful, mindful way that connects to your EDI strategy and connects to your overall mandate and your mission, you're better placed to see positive impacts. You're better placed to understand which strategies and actions work and which do not, which is really the crux of what we're trying to do. You're empowering diverse individuals and communities to share their perspectives and needs, which is really key as well. And that helps with relationship building. You're hopefully decreasing staff turnover by understanding organizational barriers and also opportunities. Um, you're appealing to diverse communities and attracting diverse partners, which kind of links to that other empowering diverse communities piece. It's part of relationship building. It's part of showing a commitment to understanding perspectives and wanting to make a change. And something that we didn't really touch on, but is risk mitigation and positive reputation. There is a risk of not taking into account people's perspectives in your efforts. And very early on in the presentation, we talked about some of the risks that have come from research that didn't include data from different people, different genders, et cetera, and then how that actually yielded products or services that didn't meet the needs of women, et cetera. So there is a risk mitigation, piece here. And there's also a piece about just being a positive organization that has a good reputation that links back to people wanting to work for your organization, wanting to apply for roles, wanting to stick around, be productive, show their loyalty, move up, and people who want to purchase your services, your goods, etc. And there are some, I won't go too in depth on this just because I think we want to do a Q&A, but there are some examples of organizations that do collect data and are seeing positive results, hopefully as some kind of correlation to their efforts. So thank you so much. I know that's a lot of information. If you ever want to reach out and get more granular insights, do let me know.
Thank you, Nancy. Wonderful presentation. There was a lot of questions that came through. So a lot of these will be addressed post-event in the information that we send out. But I'm just going to go through the ones that were upvoted the most so that we can cover some of them. So one user asked, how do you get insight from the group you're trying to include without tokenizing an employee or staff? Would you recommend having an EDI committee maybe, or reaching out to consulting?
Oh, that's a great idea. I have seen organizations, in the past have committees. I know a lot of cities, for example, have committees. I think it's also about, and this is a long-term effort, I would say. It's about building relationships with people in your networks, in the ecosystem, et cetera. Like there might be organizations doing similar like-minded work that you can get some insights from, et cetera. I think it's important to always leave the door open for people in your organization who are from like racialized backgrounds or et cetera to want to share their perspectives, but I think it's the intention and the relying on them as the sole people who are going to do that work for you versus, hey, Nancy, we're putting this project in place for Black entrepreneur youth. We've done the legwork to try to understand. Would love your perspectives. That's different than, hey, Nancy, we're doing this. Do the whole thing. Hope that helps a bit.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Um, okay, do you have a list of tangible data and benchmarks that they can measure against?
Hmm. Okay. I think two things here. I can find some stuff if this is a bit of a general question, so feel free to email me and I'll try to find something a little bit more tailored. What I would say is I think that when you're measuring, you need to be measuring against your baselines in your organization. Another organization might be doing something, but they are not as advanced as you, or they're more advanced than you. So I think it's about setting your own benchmarks. But it's always good to look at organizations in the ecosystem of what they're doing and try to emulate if they're doing good work. But why don't you email me so I can kind of get a better sense of what you're looking for?
I'm just putting Nancy's email address in the chat there for anyone.
Thank you.
No problem. I think you touched on this a little bit, but do you have sample survey questions that we can use for internal and external data collection? Surveying is a science, and we want to pose questions correctly to get the most useful data.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a number of examples that exist, and you're totally right. The way you phrase questions has an impact on how people fill them out. Whether you provide open text boxes for people to share or whether you provide drop-down options, like all of that has an impact. So I can give you some examples with some insights of like, here's maybe what you'd want to do, and here's something that you might want to avoid. So send me an email.
Um, I'm just trying to get, there's a lot of questions
There's a
that we're
lot.
trying to get. Okay, so as a small business looking to establish ED&I as a framework for the first time, is it reasonable to have someone not from an deserving group to run this project, given that they lack the lived experience? I
Hmm.
want to avoid being disingenuous, but also cognizant of asking equity deserving groups, sorry, but also cognizant of not asking equity deserving groups to do this work exclusively. And you might have actually touched on that a little bit in one of your other questions, but essentially,
Yeah.
yeah. Uh,
Yeah. So I think, how can I explain? I think that this work is not like EDI work in general shouldn't just be the responsibility of an equity deserving group, but the measurement piece, especially, it's not something that would yield itself to only an equity deserving group doing it. Like presumably, let's say you're the marketing team of I don't know, a city. Your responsibility is to understand who is accessing your channels, who's using them, et cetera. There's definitely a level of understanding why, perhaps now that you have those insights, why you're not seeing people from the South Asian community engaging with your content, coming out to your events, et cetera. Like there's a level of those kind of insights if maybe you're not from that community that you could leverage. But the overall framework of measurement and data collection is really everyone's responsibility. And I don't there are, like I said, some components that you'd maybe want to get some insights from equity deserving groups, but overall, setting those kind of metrics, et cetera, is not something that would, I think, yield itself or lend itself to just an equity deserving group do it. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
yeah. Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying, that the question should be able to cover everybody, but then to get perspective from the equity deserving groups rather than then have them do the work, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, one more question really quick. The diversity demographic data is collected as an optional volunteer basis and not mandatory. So what's your opinion about this impacting the true picture of diversity data collected and as a result compromising the report?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're right. We can't be forcing people to share their information. It's why, towards the end of the presentation, I did try to give you a little taste of how you could increase, although send me an email if you want more strategies, but how you can increase people actually wanting to participate. Oftentimes, it's people from equity deserving groups who are afraid to participate because they don't want their insights linked back to them, because that could have negative repercussions. But I would say that it's important. Well, first of all, I think you should understand the sample size. Like, if you are an organization of 500 people and 10 people filled out your survey, you need to be forthcoming with actually how many people. And if you're going to make decisions based on 10 people, on the flip side, you also need to say, okay, these 10 people came out, they shared their perspectives. Like, let me see what I can do with those perspectives. So I think it's just being honest with yourself about the sample size of people who participated, whether that's actually reflective, if there's stuff that you can do with those insights without changing the whole fabric of your organization based on 10 insights. Yeah.
Okay, we are out of time. Thank you, everyone. We will be sending out the recording. We will be sending out the slides for anyone that's asking. We will also be addressing any of these questions that we haven't answered. So the Diversity Institute will be going through all of the questions and putting together information for all of you. And we will be doing one more session closer to the end of February, and just watch our website for that. And we would love to have you there. And Nancy, thank you so very much for your contribution. It's always a pleasure working with you, and we're so happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I'll see you
Thank
soon.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.